For 2 years, Albert Freeman has started every morning by looking at the last photo taken of his father, Alan, a proud courier standing by his van. The official report said Alan likely crashed in a remote area, his van lost to the wilderness, but Albert refuses to accept it. The case goes cold until a call from the police changes everything. A construction crew digging foundations for a new warehouse has unearthed a familiar-looking mailbag strap just miles from his father's last known route. That single clue, dug up from the earth after years of silence, could change everything. What dark secret was buried with it? Let's uncover the truth together. The buzz of the old landline phone cut through the quiet of Albert's small apartment, a sound so rare it made him jump. He'd been staring at the framed photograph on his mantelpiece, a daily ritual that felt more like a duty than a comfort. In the picture, his father, Alan, beamed, a man content in his simple, orderly life. He stood proudly in his brown courier uniform, one hand resting on the side of the white van that was like his second home. The date stamp in the corner read July 15th, 2003, the day he vanished. Albert was only 19 then, and the 2 years since had felt like a lifetime of unanswered questions. The official police theory was a tragic accident. They suggested Alan, probably tired at the end of a long shift, had swerved off a rural road somewhere, his van plunging into a ravine or a dense patch of forest, hidden from view. But Albert never bought it. His father was the most careful man he knew. He checked his tires every morning, he knew his route better than the back of his hand, and he never, ever took risks. An entire van doesn't just disappear. He picked up the phone. Hello? Is this Albert Freeman? A professional, slightly weary voice asked. Yes. Who is this? This is Detective David with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about your father's case. Alan Freeman. Albert's heart hammered against his ribs. In 2 years, he hadn't received a single call about the case. It was filed away, labeled cold, forgotten by everyone but him. What about it? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A construction crew found something this morning. They're breaking ground for a new warehouse complex off Route 9, out on the old industrial lots. An excavator dug up a piece of a mailbag, a shoulder strap to be specific. The foreman thought it looked old and called us. It matches the type your father's company used. Route 9. That was part of his father's route. The old industrial lots were just a stretch of overgrown, forgotten land. Do you think it's his? Albert asked, his voice barely a whisper. We can't be sure, the detective said cautiously, but given the location, we thought you should be the first to know. Would you be willing to come down to the site? Maybe you could help us identify it. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Albert said, hanging up the phone without another word. Hope was a dangerous thing, something he'd learned to suppress over the last 730 days. But as he grabbed his keys, a flicker of it ignited in his chest. A strap. It wasn't a van, it wasn't a body, but it was something. It was the first thread to pull in 2 years of suffocating silence. The construction site was a chaotic scene of mud, machinery, and men in hard hats. Detective David met Albert at the yellow police tape, a tall man with tired eyes who looked like he'd seen too many cases like this. He led Albert over to a large pit where a yellow excavator stood silent. A group of officers were standing around a muddy object laid out on a plastic tarp. The crew foreman, Dennis, found it about an hour ago, the detective explained. His machine snagged it and pulled it up. Albert knelt down. It was a thick, dark canvas strap, caked in dirt and clay, but the faded logo of the Courier company was still visible. He ran a trembling finger over the worn fabric. He remembered his father hoisting these bags every day, the familiar squeak of the strap against his uniform. There's a serial number here, the detective said, pointing to a small metal tag. Faded, but we might be able to trace it. Does it look familiar to you? They all look the same, Albert admitted. But this feels right. This was his route. He would have been through here that afternoon. He looked around at the vast, empty lots, now being torn up by progress. For 2 years, this land had been sitting here, quiet and undisturbed. A perfect place to hide something. Why would just the strap be here? That's what we're wondering, Detective David said. It could have fallen off a bag, gotten lost. Or it could have been cut. He pointed to one end of the strap. It wasn't a clean break. It was frayed, as if it had been torn away with force. We're going to expand the search, see if the rest of the bag or anything else turns up. But for now, this is all we have. Albert stood up. his mind racing. An accident didn't make sense. His dad wouldn't just lose a strap. This felt different. This felt violent. As he drove home, the image of the torn strap was burned into his mind. It wasn't a sign of an accident. It was a sign of a struggle. For the first time, Albert allowed a darker possibility to take root in his mind. His father hadn't just disappeared. Someone had made him disappear. His new goal was no longer just to wait and hope. He had to find out who. The next morning, Albert drove to the Courier depot where his father had worked for over 20 years. The place smelled the same, a mix of cardboard, exhaust fumes, and stale coffee. A few of the older drivers recognized him and gave him sad, sympathetic nods. He asked to speak with the manager, a man who had offered his condolences 2 years ago and hadn't been heard from since. The manager was polite, but unhelpful. He offered to look up the serial number on the strap, but warned that records from that time might be incomplete. Feeling frustrated, Albert decided to change his approach. He needed to talk to the people who knew his father's daily routine, the people who worked alongside him. He asked the manager for a list of drivers who were on the same shift as his dad back in 2003. Most of them have moved on, the manager said, pulling up an old file on his computer. But let's see, your father's main partner, the guy who'd cover his route if he was sick, was Adrian. Adrian, let me check his last name. The name clicked in Albert's memory. Adrian. His dad had mentioned him a few times. He was an older guy, always complaining about being broke, close to retirement. Did he retire? Albert asked. The manager scrolled through the file. Funny you should ask. He took an early retirement package just a few months after your father went missing. Said he'd had enough of the road. Can't say I blamed him. A few months after. The timing felt strange. Do you have a forwarding address for him? Albert asked. The manager reluctantly gave him an address in a suburb about an hour away. As Albert drove, a sense of unease settled over him. Why would a man who constantly worried about money suddenly take early retirement? It didn't add up. Adrian lived in a surprisingly nice house, a new-looking split level with a perfectly manicured lawn. It wasn't the kind of house a man who was worried about his pension could afford. When Adrian opened the door, Albert saw a man who had aged significantly. His face was drawn and pale, and his eyes darted around nervously. Can I help you? He asked, his voice raspy. My name is Albert Freeman. I'm Alan Freeman's son. Recognition, followed by panic, flashed in Adrian's eyes. Oh. Right. I heard what happened. Terrible business. What do you want? I was hoping to ask you a few questions about my father. You worked with him. You knew his routine. Adrian's jaw tightened. He didn't invite Albert inside, instead blocking the doorway. Look, son, that was a long time ago. Your dad was a good guy, kept to himself. We all figured he had an accident. The police said so. The police are looking at the case again, Albert said, watching Adrian's reaction closely. They found something near his old route. Adrian's face went pale. Found what? A piece of one of his mailbags, Albert said, intentionally leaving out the details. I just thought maybe you remembered something from that day. Anything unusual? No, Adrian said, too quickly. It was just a normal day. Nothing happened. Alan was probably just tired, that's all. Stressed. He started to close the door. I'm sorry about your father, but I can't help you. I've moved on. The door clicked shut, leaving Albert standing on the porch, his heart pounding. Adrian wasn't just unhelpful. He was defensive. He was scared. Albert walked back to his car, Adrian's nervous face replaying in his mind. He hadn't just moved on. He was running from something. Back at his apartment, Albert couldn't let it go. He opened his laptop and started digging. He searched public records, property sales, anything he could find on Adrian. For hours, he found nothing. Then, he stumbled upon an article in a local real estate blog from late 2003. It featured a list of recent home sales in the suburb where Adrian lived. And there it was. Adrian's name, listed as the buyer of his new house. The sale price was high, far more than a courier's salary could support. But the most damning detail was in the fine print. The property was purchased with cash. Albert stared at the screen, a cold dread washing over him. Adrian, the man who was always broke, had paid for a new house in cash just 4 months after his father disappeared. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a payoff. His father's disappearance wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a random act of violence. It was connected to Adrian, and whatever secret his father had uncovered, he had paid for it with his life. The next day, Albert sat across from Detective David in a small, sterile interview room at the sheriff's department, laying out everything he had found. He explained Adrian's sudden retirement, his nervous and defensive behavior, and the most crucial piece of evidence, the cash purchase of his house. The detective listened patiently, making notes on a legal pad. When Albert finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen on the table. "A cash purchase is suspicious, I'll give you that," he said, "but it's not illegal. He could have inherited money, won the lottery." "He was always broke," Albert insisted. "My dad told me so. He was always complaining about bills. A man like that doesn't just come into a fortune overnight without a story." "You're right," the detective conceded. "It's a strong lead, strong enough to look into his finances officially, and your conversation with him helps. His nervous reaction gives us a reason to be suspicious." He paused, looking at Albert with a newfound respect. "You've done good work, son. Most people just wait for us to call." "I can't just wait," Albert said. "It's my father." Detective David nodded. "Let us take it from here. We'll get a warrant to look at Adrian's bank records. In the meantime, I want you to stay away from him. If he's involved, he's dangerous." The next few days were agonizing. Albert tried to go about his life, but his mind was consumed with the case. Every time the phone rang, he expected it to be the detective. Finally, the call came. "We got the warrants," Detective David said, his voice tense with excitement. "Adrian's financial records are a mess. There are no large withdrawals that would account for the house purchase, no inheritance, no lottery winnings. The money appeared out of nowhere, but we found something else, something better." "What is it?" Albert asked, holding his breath. "We started looking into the land where the strap was found. For years, it was leased by a local hunting club. We pulled the membership list from 2003. Guess whose name was on it?" "Adrian," Albert whispered. "Bingo," the detective said. He knew that land. He hunted there. He knew how remote and forgotten it was. It was the perfect place to make something disappear. The pieces were all falling into place. Adrian had the motive, money. And he had the location, a place he knew intimately, where no one would ever think to look. "We're bringing him in for questioning now," the detective continued. "We don't have enough to arrest him for murder yet, but with the financial evidence and his connection to the site, we have enough to hold him for obstruction. We're hoping he'll break under pressure." Albert asked if he could be at the station. The detective hesitated, but then agreed. "You deserve to see this through. Stay in my office. I'll let you know what happens." At the station, Albert paced the detective's small office, the muffled sounds of the interrogation room filtering through the wall. He could hear raised voices, then long stretches of silence. Hours crawled by. Finally, Detective David walked in, his face grim but resolved. "He's asking for a lawyer," he said. But before he did, he slipped up. He said, "You can't prove I was even there." He never mentioned where there was. We hadn't told him we knew he was a member of the hunting club. It was the crack they needed. "What now?" Albert asked. "Now we get a warrant to search the entire property. We're bringing in a geological survey team with ground-penetrating radar. If that van is buried out there, they'll find it." The excavation began the next morning. The industrial lot was transformed into a massive, organized grid search. Albert stood with Detective David on a ridge overlooking the scene, watching as the team scanned the earth, section by section. For hours, they found nothing but buried rocks and old debris. Albert's hope began to fade. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe Adrian was just a guilty-looking man with a lucky streak. Then one of the technicians shouted, "I've got something. A large metallic anomaly, about 12 feet down." They brought in the excavator, the same machine that had found the strap. It began to dig, scooping out huge mouthfuls of dirt and clay. A crowd of officers gathered around the edge of the growing pit. After what felt like an eternity, the bucket of the excavator scraped against something metal with a sickening screech. It was white. "That's it," Albert breathed, his legs feeling weak. The workers began digging by hand, carefully clearing the soil away. First, the roof of the van emerged, then the sides. It was his father's van, crushed and mangled, but unmistakable. The team forced open the rear doors. The mailbags were still inside, scattered and torn. And in the driver's seat, they found him. Detective David put a hand on Albert's shoulder, trying to shield him from the view, but it was too late. The image of what was left of his father would be with him forever. Later that day, faced with the undeniable evidence, Adrian's lawyer advised him to confess. In a quiet, monotone voice, he told them everything. His story was one of simple, pathetic greed. He had gotten involved with a local smuggling ring, using the Courier network to move undeclared jewels and cash. He thought it was a secret, but Alan, meticulous and observant Alan, had noticed inconsistencies in the manifests. He saw Adrian handling packages that weren't on the official logs. He confronted Adrian in the depot parking lot on that final day, telling him he had to report it. Adrian panicked. He knew that going to prison would ruin him. In a moment of rage and fear, he struck Alan from behind with a tire iron. He bundled his partner's body into the van and, under the cover of darkness, drove it out to the hunting grounds he knew so well. He used a backhoe from a nearby farm, owned by a cousin in on the smuggling, to dig a deep pit and bury the van, evidence and all. The smuggling ring paid him handsomely for his silence and for taking care of the problem. That money was used to buy his new life. The single strap must have torn off during the struggle and fallen unnoticed, only to be found 2 years later by the blades of progress. A week later, Albert held a proper funeral for his father. The small church was filled with friends, family, and couriers in their brown uniforms, all there to honor the man they knew, not the mystery he had become. The story was no longer about a man who vanished, but about a good man who was killed for doing the right thing. The pain of the truth was immense, but it was a clean pain, not the ragged, tearing agony of uncertainty. Standing at his father's graveside, Albert finally felt a sense of peace. The questions that had haunted his every waking moment for 2 years were answered. He had found the truth. He had brought his father home. What would you have done in Albert's situation? Would you have been able to let the police handle the investigation? Or would you, like him, have needed to pursue the truth on your own, no matter the risk? If you found this story compelling, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a mystery with a powerful human element at its core. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. Thank you for listening.